Okay, so we want to do an office hours this week and specifically focus on protocol security. The reasons are obvious, probably don't need to restate them. Um, and so we brought on Dawson, who is our CTO, to kind of walk through some of the things that we are both working on and planning to work on, and um, kind of walk through some security best practices. We're actually going to work on a kind of a blog post education series for other projects. We've been in the space for quite a while, built a number of projects. And so we think we might have a few things to offer to others. Um, but this is kind of going to be the kickoff for that. So I guess quickly to start with, Dawson, I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, introduce yourself to folks. I don't think most folks know you, and just, hear about whatever you want to share, using proper OPSEC, but a little bit about your background.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Parker. So my name's Dawson. Been working in the crypto space for a while now, and then I've been involved in crypto a little bit longer than that. So before working on Apyx, I was working at Kraken, also in engineering, and then worked in a bunch of different parts of that. So everything from infrastructure to front end to back end, all over the place. So obviously recently been very focused on Apyx and just the cool stuff that we're building here. And yeah, my role at Apyx, like Parker mentioned, so it's the CTO, but like my core focus has really been on our on-chain contracts, our security, and our infrastructure. Of course, I think we have a great app. We're adding more features. We're going to keep making that better. But, the core of it is really those on-chain contracts and making sure that everything on-chain and our infrastructure stays secure.
Awesome. Yeah, the saying about Rome, right? Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was burned in a day. Um, and it's really unfortunate for some of these projects that maybe take a little bit of a shortcut, not too crazy, but a little bit of a shortcut on the security side and ultimately evaporate everything that they built over multiple years. So we want to certainly avoid that here from the outset. Um, so maybe the first question to start off with, Dawson, obviously there's the on-chain contracts, but can you kind of walk through at a high level some of the key areas of vulnerabilities? Of course, we've got the contracts, but now, we got oracles, bridges, so on and so forth. Like, what are some of the main areas that you think about, some of the main buckets?
Yeah, I think it's the contracts. And of course, once the contracts are correct, we're continuing to integrate, but as we integrate into different protocols, it opens us up to different vulnerabilities. So like each of these protocols that we're talking to or that we're integrating with, we're thinking about how does that increase the surface area or the risk associated with it, and then how do we mitigate that? And I think you can see this in our Oracle deployments. You also mentioned Oracle's, Parker. So our oracles aren't an aggregation of secondary market prices that could be manipulated through things like flash loans. So our oracles are either feeding off the direct conversion rate, or it's going to be an oracle that's like being updated based off of our collateralization or the redemption rates that are fed off chain. So, like we launched Accountable this week. We've been thinking, like, we've been talking a lot internally about oracles, and now that we have the solution that can publish these cryptographic attestations, we're thinking a lot about, well, how do we take that all the way from off chain to on chain so that whole pipeline end to end for our oracles that are supporting these markets are going to be fully verified, fully secured. Um, and then I guess aside from sort of like the contracts, the oracles, of course, there's the infrastructure. Our application is a DApp, so we're maintaining as little backend data as possible. Like we don't want to be maintaining the state because there's a risk to doing so. It increases complexity. So like interacting with Apex is through your wallet. It's self-custody, and we're not, proxying transactions. We're not uh, managing anything on the backend that we'd be worried about disclosure. But of course, we're doing everything to secure that infrastructure and backend as well. And then I think probably the final piece is the multi-sigs, the actual governance. So how do we administer and maintain and develop the protocol, and how do we secure that? And yeah, thinking a lot about that. We're actually, we kicked off an audit today to yet another security audit to make sure that we have that buttoned up as well.
Yeah, and that last piece is really important because I think, obviously that's what ultimately got drift. Um, but talk to me a little bit about, some of the lessons learned from Kraken on kind of the OPSEC side from the human side of things.
Yeah, interesting. Well, okay, so I remember, like little aside, but uh, back in the day when Joseph and I were working for Kraken, and we're so paranoid that we're in the room, and whenever somebody enters a password, it's like the blinds are closed, we're playing white noise, we're worried about these sort of like remote audio attacks where people are recording, like keystrokes from a distance or something. So I think that might have been paranoia, but yeah, from the OPSEC perspective, I mean, there's a lot that we're doing there. So everybody has, of course, like hardware devices, has backups of the hardware devices, have dedicated devices for signing. So, for example, like when we're signing transactions, we're not going to be signing those transactions on our daily driver. Especially on the engineering side, this is a risk because we're going to be building software, running packages. So there's a big risk of supply chain attacks. So sort of like air gapping and isolating the devices that we're using to sign as part of that multi-sig is a big part of it. And then, of course, just working from, secure environments, uh, locking down our IT infrastructure. So even just looking at like how we're managing information that's coming into the team and making sure that people can't be phished or people can't be socially engineered. Like these are things that uh, I think where we all have that background coming from Kraken. Like Kraken has an amazing, fantastic security culture, and I think we were kind of like bred in that environment, and we're just carrying that forward into Apyx.
Yeah, that's it's a great story about you and Joseph back in the day. Um, yeah, I remember joining Kraken and this is back in 2018 and it was like, oh my goodness, like what is this place with, for example, the two different email addresses and all the internal email addresses were like PGP signed. Um, yeah, that was, this two separate email addresses I'd never seen before. That was an interesting one. But I think one of Kraken's values, productively paranoid, I think is really useful. And you certainly want to balance it against being actually paranoid. That's why it's productively paranoid. But, I think that mindset is really helpful because um, it only takes, one slip up, one mistake to have a problem. And so if you're paranoid and you don't even trust yourself and you realize like, hey, I might make a mistake here. Let's make sure we've got multiple layers of security. Um, that can ultimately protect you from an issue, but it all starts with that mindset and that like background, that training, that almost like a security boot camp, if you will, which I think Kraken was just fantastic for. And a lot of teams, don't get. Um, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, like absolutely, like that paranoia, that notion of trust. I think that leads into like constantly thinking about failure states. So this, like you were asking about, sort of physical security, OPSEC, but then also just in terms of like the engineering we're doing. I think I spend at least 50% of my time, like when we're designing something, we're looking at an integration, not thinking about how do we build that integration or build that feature, but what are the failure states of that feature? And then of course the goal is always to assume that, this will be compromised, this will fail, and then how do we make sure that we fail closed or we fail in a way that's safe and secure? And it's kind of uh, like akin to playing chess. Like sometimes when you're playing chess, you don't play a position to try to create an attack. You play a position to try to not leave any openings, and then you just wait. And if you wait long enough, then the enemy will leave an opening for you. And in this case, we don't have that like direct back and forth adversarial relationship, but like we are playing this long game of chess. It's very tactical and very strategic. And we have to be constantly thinking about, well, how could this fail? Or what happens if this piece gets compromised? And how do we make sure that there's not a contagion that leaks into the rest of the system?
Yeah, I mean it's wild thinking about how many of these attacks have been DPRK, and maybe sometimes they're the boogeyman and it's not actually them, but certainly a $200-300 million, like we've seen in the last two, well, honestly, three examples with Resolve as well, $200-300 million prize pots. Like, actors can put significant resources behind it. I mean, they should be willing to, in theory, spend up to $200 million to, crack that egg. Um, and so, it's quite the challenge, but it's, super important to maintain this kind of sobering reminder that there are very well-funded adversaries that are trying to break in, and to not take that for granted. And also to, take the kind of take the personal responsibility to heart that just because XYZ counterparty that's well trusted in the space said, yeah, here's how you set it up. Here's the default. Not trying to throw someone under the bus, but like, yeah, here's the default. Here's what everyone else does. It's fine. Like, not taking anything for granted, and recognizing that, not even the US government can step in and save you here. Like, we are the first and last line of defense for our protocol users, and we need to take that incredibly seriously. Um, so in the vein I mentioned just a moment ago, defaults. Dawson, can you talk a little bit about, without calling out any names, maybe some examples, either current or in the past, that you've seen of some of the defaults that are maybe widely trusted by, you know, a subset of people actually having some issues, and where we need to, or where you've had to customize something to kind of go above and beyond?
Uh, yeah, interesting question. So I think that, uh, like in terms of Apex, obviously we've developed like custom and specific tokens. And I guess like maybe a good example in regards to Apex would be minting. So I think that there's like a default to assume that, okay, you have a multi-sig, and given a multi-sig, you can go ahead and you can, like mint this asset, and there's going to be X number of people that need to approve that. And that's sort of that's the control, like that's the line that people tend to draw. So in our case, we took that farther. Uh, Spent a lot of time on this as well. And, even at a certain point said like, hey, are we going to appreciate these controls in the future? And I think we very much do, especially what we've seen over the past month. So in terms of minting, we have like multiple layers. So of course we have the multi-sig. We also have a supply cap on Apyx USD that limits the total amount. We have a rate limit that limits the amount that can be minted over a period. And then we have a maximum amount that can be submitted in a single mint. And we have a multi-step mint process with a delay. So what that means is when you submit a mint, you have to submit a request to mint. Then there's an enforced delay period, enforced on chain. When a mint is submitted, the team gets spammed through PagerDuty, so we all get alerts. We can review it. There's a period where it can be canceled, and then if it isn't canceled, it can be executed. When it's executed, it has to be less than the max mint size, and there also has to be less than the rate limit minted per period. So, less than X amount minted per 24 hours. And the total minted has to be less than the supply cap for APX USD. And sort of like what all these layers of controls give us is a limit to exposure. So we could say that, even if that multi-sig with these mint controls are compromised, there's no scenario where there could be a runaway mint that's greater than X, right? So they could mint up to the rate limit within that period, assuming they've compromised M of N of the hardware keys. And that really like limits the protocol exposure to this type of risk, right? It means that if this happens, like there will be, or there could be a mint, and that could be dumped on the market, but we know that that's going to be less than 10% of the circulating supply or something, as opposed to like where we might have seen protocols where there's been an issue like this. There's some like mint or bridge issue, and then you see like 100% of the current supply minted and just dumped on the market, and it's just totally bottoms out to zero or something.
Yeah, that's a good overview there. The other area where we've seen issues is obviously on the price oracle side, and we kind of talked about that. But could you talk a little bit about the kind of full stack of supply chain risks that can occur on the oracle front, all the way from the end, the beginning data source, the API, all the way through to on chain?
Yeah, for sure. So, so there's a ton of risk here, right? So we are providing a crypto asset that effectively wraps an RWA, and that means that the source of truth is off chain, and we need to get that on chain. So you could think effectively like from that source of truth, like from the exchange or the broker, all the way to getting it on chain, there could be attacks anywhere in between, and that could be dependency in a package, like an update to a system, like it could be a phishing email. But if you have this long chain of intermediaries or these proxies where it's sort of like coming from the broker to an API that's aggregating it, through another system that's publishing, maybe via Chainlink, and then it ends up on chain, any of these pieces could be a target. And if we look at, like we look at the Kelp DAO hack and how that was actually executed, where there's an RPC node, and that RPC node was compromised to return bad data under like very specific circumstances to effectively trick the verifiers for the layer 0 bridge to publish a message to like mint tokens or move tokens across the bridge. So you could imagine that like there's a similar attack surface for any of these oracles or any of these bridging solutions. And the way that, I guess talk about like a little bit of our internal roadmap, like what I've really been focused on this week and will be focused on next week, is addressing that. So of course, like we launched Accountable this week. Accountable is super cool. And like really the goal with Accountable is to solve that problem end to end, to make it cryptographically secure and cryptographically obvious if there's funny business going on or if somebody in the middle has been compromised. So Accountable runs inside of a secure enclave, which is a special piece of hardware that has an embedded private key that cannot be extracted, that signs cryptographic measurements of the binary that are running. So there's a known valid binary, and the hardware will sign an attestation saying that this is the binary that I'm running, and it signs with a key that we can verify. And then that binary is going to produce the response. So totally black box to us, like we can't customize how it's pulling the data out of these third parties. It's going to pull that and it's going to aggregate it. And then it's going to produce a signed message, and that could be passed through, n intermediaries. So in this case, it's going to go from our infrastructure running Accountable in the secure enclave to Chainlink, and then Chainlink is going to publish it on chain. And that means that, if our node that's actually running Accountable is ever compromised, or the proxy sitting in between, like the load balancer sitting between us and Chainlink is going to see that immediately, and they're going to be able to verify that cryptographic information in the response and say, okay, either the binary's changed or the response has been tampered with, and we're not going to publish this on chain. And that, sort of end to end secures the oracle. And that's, so like that's one of the cool things that we're working towards. Like Accountable is really cool, really awesome that we have this dashboard that everybody can see that it's independently verified, and that sort of black box, like we can, add API keys and it can pull in data, but we can't change how it's pulling in that data. But then taking that a step further and having that like full end to end cryptographically verifiable pipeline where it goes from off-chain, on-chain to create those oracles, I think is like that's the goal, right? Like that's the place that we're going to get to.
Yeah, super interesting. How do you think about, like let's say we're a $10 billion protocol, or let's say crazy times, we're like a $1 trillion protocol. What are some of on the price oracle side, what are some of the supply chain risks that maybe we don't have to be too worried about today, but maybe might need to be worried about, at those higher levels where we become a much bigger target?
Uh, yeah, interesting. So, so in terms of supply chain risks, and then Parker, you mean so? Uh,
Like, and this is entirely unscripted, so I'm just freeballing here. But like one example I could see would be, you know, someone actually figuring out which API feeds are going in, to give us, say, the price of STRC
yeah,
and going and
yeah,
like
interesting.
targeting that company.
Yeah, yeah. So I think like when we're thinking about supplying this data on chain, there's sort of two parts to it. So there's correctness and accuracy, and I think most of what I've ranted about so far has been correctness. And I'd say something is correct if it's verifiable, right? So in this case, like I've talked about, well, we have signed attestations or signatures for everything. You can tell that it's correct, but maybe it's not accurate. And an example of it not being accurate is, well, the third-party API, maybe the brokerage API, the exchange API that we're pulling from, publishes inaccurate data, or they've actually been targeted. So, like you're suggesting, this third party could be targeted uh, to feed to feed inaccurate data into this pipeline to be published on chain. So to address that, we're looking at a handful of controls. So uh, and most of these controls come down to having somebody step in and then review and be able to sign off and say either yes, this is or is not correct, or is not accurate. So examples of that would be adding like a jump protection. Like if we were to see that the total collateral suddenly drops by more than X percentage, that's going to trigger an alert, and that's going to go out to a team member, and somebody's going to have to jump on, and they're going to have to verify that. Uh, we can also put sort of like a safe band, like we'd expect it to be within a certain range, within a certain period of time. And then another one would be including a parallel and independent feed. So we have accountable, and accountable is pulling this information, and then it's providing this cryptographically verifiable uh, data that describes the amount of collateral in the system. And of course, we also have our internal systems for keeping track of collateral. So we can sort of maintain both of these independently. Where accountable is a black box, and then we have our system that pulls and reconciles our collateral, and we can compare those, and we could say, well, with these two independent feeds developed and maintained by independent teams, where one of them is entirely black box to us, what's the delta on the feeds? And if the delta is greater than X, again, that's going to trip a circuit breaker, and that's going to send an alert out to a team member, and somebody's going to have to jump on, and they're going to have to manually review that and engage with it.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so shifting gears a little bit here, we've bridged to base using Chainlink CCIP, and we've talked pretty publicly about our plans to bridge to the Solana and maybe some other chains as well. How do you think about bridge security? Obviously, that was the failure point here with Kelp DAO, but there's been other bridge failures in the past as well. Like, talk to me a little bit about how you think about bridge security.
Yeah, bridging is really interesting. And, um, bridging sort of breaks one of the invariants of a blockchain, which is this idea that there's not an invalid state. Like when you're sending a transaction on a blockchain, the transaction either executes or doesn't. And if it executes, that's a valid state. If it doesn't execute, that's a valid state. But when you start bridging, you can have these invalid states. And that's effectively like what most of these bridge hacks are, right? So you can have a situation where you've sent assets on, chain A, but you don't receive assets on chain B, or vice versa. You haven't actually sent assets on chain A, but you receive assets. You trick somebody into sending you assets on chain B, and that's the invariant being violated, and that's one of these invalid states that can happen. So we actually looked at layer 0, and then we ended up opting to use Chainlink because of some of the differences in configuration there. So Chainlink does have 2 layers of verification. So they have 2 independently operated layers of verification for every message that's traveling across the bridge. And that's not negotiable. Like it's not the case that you can, pick one and disable another, or you can configure it. We can't run our own verifier that has some sort of like admin permissions to be able to verify transactions across the bridge. So we're sort of inheriting the same security that Chainlink provides for all of the assets that it supports on bridging. And then I think the other part of it is that, of course, we can configure additional controls in the token pool. So when you're bridging across chains with Chainlink, you have a token pool associated to the token on either side. So in this case, we have a lock and release pool on Ethereum, and then we have a mint and burn pool on Base. And that means when you transfer APX USD from Ethereum over to Base, you're locking one APX USD on Ethereum, and then we're actually minting one APX USD on Base. So if you want to know what the total supply of APX USD is, you can always look at Ethereum and you can see that. And that's going to include all of the chains that it's bridged out to. So the risk here is that we could have one of these invalid states. So if the 2 layers of verification on the verifier network were to fail, then there could be a situation where, for example, APX USD could be minted on Base when it hasn't been locked on Ethereum, or vice versa. And the way that we've looked at mitigating that, again, is through limiting exposure. So we have a rate limit that's enforced in the token pools that limits the amount that can be bridged back and forth. And I think that's maybe around 5% of the total supply, which means that if there were a situation like we saw, with KelpDAO, where there's one of these bridge vulnerabilities, at most 5% of the asset could be minted and then bridged across to be dumped, for example. And that really like limits the total protocol exposure to these bridge vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, Another area that is super important is the kind of the OPSEC side, the human side. And you talked a little bit about that with the, managing the admin contracts. But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on some of the other practical considerations about like how you distribute keys, how you back up keys, travel policies, physical security, kind of some of these things that honestly are good practices for everyone to implement in their daily lives if they're holding coins themselves, not just for, multi-sig signers in a big protocol.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I guess starting with keys, obviously everybody should have a hardware wallet. I think the UX for hardware wallets has got really good. So I think like the delta between using a hardware wallet and a software wallet is really small, but the the mitigation of risk there is really huge. Like the aside from a hardware vulnerability, the only way that you'd be compromised there would be if you're sort of like socially engineered, you're tricked into signing a transaction, but it's not the case that somebody's going to be able to put a piece of software on your machine and then extract the key from that device. And that's like really, really important. And then I think in addition to having the hardware wallet, you should put a password on it. So, like these hardware wallets allow you to, like most of them will allow you to put a PIN code. and then they give you the backup code. But most of them also have the option to add a 25th word to the recovery phrase, which gets included in the key derivation when the key is generated on the physical device. And this is important because it effectively splits your key into two different parts. So, there's one part of it that is uh, the seed that is what you write down on a piece of paper and what is actually stored in the hardware of the device. And there's another part of it, and that's the passphrase. And, really that's only stored in your mind. And that's totally required to derive the key that you use. Uh, and for some devices, they allow to have multiple passphrases, and this makes it really easy to derive different wallets for different purposes while keeping them all on a single hardware device. So yeah, highly recommend a hardware device, and I recommend using a password on the hardware device.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Sorry, I think sorry about that.
Oh,
My screen locked. Can you guys still hear me?
yep.
Cool. Um, yeah, and then on the physical side, I think, like have a dedicated device for signing transactions. When you're interacting, like with dApps, you should create a separate profile in your browser for interacting with them. And then you should bookmark everything so you're not searching for and clicking through links that are being sent around. And then, of course, like work from a secured environment. So don't be bringing the device that you use for signing or use for interacting with crypto to the cafe, for example. For protocols like Apyx, like we're conscious about if we all get together. Like we've talked about this because there's some conferences coming up. If we should all like get together into one space, and who's going to be like traveling with each other, like stuff like this comes up. And of course, like we want to make sure we don't have like a quorum of individuals in the same location. And these are just concerns that you have as well, right?
Yep. Yeah, and I think, if you look at some of the background on the drift hack, there was absolutely some social engineering that went on. And so that's kind of a part of it, is like staying super vigilant on, even at some of these events, some of these conferences, like who you're meeting, who you're talking to, even people you kind of feel like you might trust. If it's a random that you met on the internet, and even 6 months into the relationship, if they're sending you, some stuff to download on your machine, um, you got to be careful there. And so that's where the backup signing device comes in, because, you can take all these precautions as an individual, but you should assume that at some point, maybe someone is compromised, because, 6 months in, you've been building a great relationship with somebody, and then that's finally when they spring the trap. Or maybe one of your legitimate partners is, breached. And so if you're working with, a fund or a curator or another dApp, and maybe their security is kind of lax, and you trust them because they're good guys and whatever, and they're not trying to do anything malicious, but if they get breached, that could become an issue. And so, just building in a lot of controls such that, even if the physical security for one person or two people does fail, that still doesn't create an issue. So it's
Yeah,
definitely something to
absolutely.
consider as well. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just agreeing. Yeah, just agreeing with what you're saying, man.
Alrighty, well, we're going to be spending a lot more time, as I mentioned earlier, talking about security. We got a number of blog posts. We've got some more audits coming up on different facets. So certainly stay tuned, but we're always happy to answer questions here, to the extent that it doesn't compromise some of the things that we're doing, so there is some security and a little bit of secrecy. But, appreciate you guys attending, and appreciate y'all following along with our journey here.